Hi everyone, Julia here from The Art of Creating, and today I'm sharing another tutorial with you. Here I'm showing you how I've painted this sunset sky and its reflection in the water. The first thing I did was divide my paper into half and draw a horizon line with just a normal pencil. Then I have thoroughly wetted the whole area to make sure that the water soaks into the paper and the paper stays wet as long as possible, because in this case we are going to work on the whole paper all at the same time, so which means that we need the whole area to stay wet as long as possible to give us a nice smooth wash of color. I've started with the blue and I'm using a cerulean blue from the White Nights paint set, and I've just put a few marks with my paintbrush where I see that color in between the darker clouds. I'm using a reference photo for this painting, so I'm just referring to it constantly to see where I see all the different colors. Then I'm adding a little bit of yellow, and I'm just making sure that the yellow doesn't mix in too much with the blue, and just leaving a few gaps and some areas for it to mix with oranges and reds, but to stay away from the blue. And where it does accidentally blend in too much and it starts becoming too green, I can just grab just rinse my brush and clean it up a little bit. Then I'm adding a bit of reds and oranges. So for orange, I've mixed a bit of yellow with carmine, and in some areas I've added cadmium red. It's more of a orangey red color, where carmine is more of a pinkish purplish color. And then when I've kind of marked out the areas where those pinks and sort of lighter colors are, I've started adding a little bit more darker purple, and in the sky basically you see where the sun is sort of towards the middle of the page, it's more of a yellow color. Then you start seeing more oranges, and then brighter pinks, and then really dark purples as you get to the top of the paper. And when you are painting, and if you're painting a landscape where you have water and the water is fairly clear, then you will see a reflection in the water of anything that's above your horizon line. So that includes buildings, mountains, trees, and the sky. So you are going to see all of the colors that you see in the sky reflected back in the water. So when we're painting a landscape like this, it is important to try and place the colors and the shapes in kind of like a mirror image, the top half and the bottom half. So there can be some variations. It can be a little bit longer, like the reflection can be a little bit longer or appear longer on the bottom part of the painting, and they can be distorted as well, because you do have water movement, so it distorts your reflections a little bit, but it is best to try and replicate it as closely as possible, and it will look more realistic. So as I'm going throughout the painting, I'm just adding the colors, intensifying some of the colors, moving colors around, using my brush to basically have those movements of clouds, and I'm sort of using different side of the brush. So I'm using the flat side and the point of it, of sort of kind of holding it with the tip of the brush to create a nice fine line, and then I'm using it as a flat brush to get a bigger coverage of paint, as well as moving the paint around, and then in some areas starting as a flat brush and then moving it. As I'm moving it across the paper, I turn the brush and sort of end with a flat side so that I get a nice tapered end to it, and it sort of gives the clouds look like it gives it more depth. So the clouds are starting as like a bigger sort of a area of color, and then it looks like it just goes into the distance and becomes smaller. And because my paper is still wet as I'm working through it in different areas to make sure that I add color and water around the whole page where I see especially it's starting to dry. I'm able to keep adding and moving the paint, and here I've taken a bit of a tissue and just cleaned up the area, made a bit of like a dot for where the sky is to take away that bright yellow color, so that you can see that there is the sun in that area. And in my second wash of color on the paper, after this layer has dried, I'm going to add more color to it as well, so that it doesn't look white. But in this first layer, I've taken out as much paint as I could, just so that there's a definition of the sun. And it's just easiest to do it with a bit of a tissue than try to paint around it, and you probably wouldn't get a nice firstly it would take longer, and then secondly you probably wouldn't get a nice clean edge around it. And you don't want it to be too clean either, because if you look at any reference of the sun or the landscape with the sun in it, you can see like it's got a bit of a cloud covering it, and it's not like a perfect circle. So then I'm going over it with a second layer. You've got to make sure that your first layer has dried completely, and then you just grab a nice big brush to cover the area as quickly as possible, and you just cover the whole area with clean water, making sure that you don't rub anything, so that you don't want to lift any color underneath. And then you just go over it with the colors that you want to add. So it depends on at what stage your painting is at and what colors you might want to add. I've pretty much gone over everything with just more color to intensify it. So I've added a bit more blue, and I've just made orange just a little bit more vibrant as well. And I've decided that I wanted a bit more red, not just carmine, which is more of a pink tone. I've just added a fair bit more cadmium red there as well, especially at the bottom, just to make it look more intense. And then I've also added much darker purples as well, just to also, well, one, to kind of frame the picture so that it draws your eye to the center of it, and secondly to add a bit more intense and moody feel to the painting as well, sort of giving it more of a sunset look, where you have the sun setting and the clouds that are not lit up by the sun, they become much darker. So for that I'm using a mix of violet and carmine, and as I'm adding more darker and darker colors, especially around the edges, I'm also adding a bit of Payne's grey into the mix as well. When you are painting reflections and you are replicating what's at the top and trying to match it at the bottom part of the painting, make sure that you're also leaving a bit of a gap between the two parts, so that it gives you a bit of room to add something in your landscape, like buildings, trees, mountains, things like that, so that you don't put your sun right at the line, right at the horizon line, unless of course that is what you're trying to replicate, but then everything would be much closer, and then you won't have any room to add trees because it will then cover up the sun. So if you're wanting to add something in between, you need to leave a bit of a gap, and you can see that I've left a bit of a lighter gap between my two parts of the painting because there's going to be some buildings and some trees, and I want to leave a bit of a light area there as well, where there's you will see in the next part where there is some lighter colors in the buildings as well. As the final touches of the sky, I'm just using my brush to tap a bit more color into the sky and its reflection, sort of so that it's not just complete lines and wavy lines in the sky. So there's like a few little spots that look like clouds. It just makes it a bit more natural and more interesting. And of course, just intensifying some colors, because as we all know, watercolor dries much lighter, and it's hard to gauge what darkness your colors will be. That's why we need to often go in with a second layer of paint as well, especially to intensify the shadows and the darker areas, because once they dry, they will become much lighter and you might need to go over it again. So at this stage, if you are happy with how your colors are looking, that's fine. You can move on to the next stage as I'm showing you here. Or if you still want to intensify some of your colors and maybe move some things around, you might want to go in with the third layer. And it doesn't matter, it's how you feel about your painting. If you need to add some more, you just need to let it dry and then go in again with another layer. So the bottom part is obviously a reflection of the sky in the water, which means that you get water ripples and waves, and it's not flat like the sky. So to do that, we're just going to do a few faint lines to indicate the ripples in the water, and you just need to be careful what color you're doing them. They're very subtle, especially in the lighter areas. They're very, very subtle and hardly noticeable, but in the darker areas you can see them in a few areas a bit more prominent. So they are basically a darker shade of the color where it is. If you can imagine, as the water is moving and creating the ripples, it is the color that is reflected in the water. So it's still the same color reflected, but as the ripples are kind of washing over the water, they're creating the shadows. So they're kind of darker color of the color that's reflecting. So in other words, you won't find dark purple ripples in the light blue or orange reflections where the sun is. You need to either make it a little bit more orangey or slightly darker blue in the blue areas, and the purple color lines will go where the purple color is, and it's kind of like extending a little bit to the pink areas that's next to it, because as the light reflects and kind of distorts the reflection, you can see those lines kind of extending from those purple areas. So I'm just going around, just making a few adjustments here, making water look a little bit more like water, so that it's not like a mirror image, not like a mirror reflection. And after we finished with this bit, it is going to dry completely to make sure our next stage is not going to bleed into the sky or the water. And we're going to do our middle part. For this middle part, I've grabbed a round brush. It's fairly small, but large enough to contain enough paint so that I don't have to keep dipping it into the paint to grab some more and continue working. So in the reference image, the middle part has a lot of buildings in it. If you look closely, you can see the different shapes of the different buildings, but from the distance, you can't really tell. You can just see that there is something there, but you can't tell what it is or what types of buildings they are. So I'm not focusing too much on detail here. I just want to give an idea that there is something there, some sort of buildings, and I'm just going around with a really dark color. So it's mostly Payne's gray with a little bit of green mixed into it, and I'm just going over it, making sure that the horizon line is straight. You need to make sure that your horizon line is straight, otherwise it won't look realistic. And then I'm just going over and kind of painting in the buildings where I'm just kind of drawing rectangles with like a few lines to indicate that there are some windows, maybe some shapes for roofs, and just darkening up the bottom of it a little bit, just so that you get a bit of an idea that there is something in the background. And then I'm just painting in a little bit of light blue color into the windows where and like the walls of those buildings, so that it stands out a little bit. And once that part's done, then I'm mixing up another paint mix, and that is partially Payne's Grey and partially green. So I want to do it in layers, so some of the foliage is a little bit lighter in the background, and then some parts of it are going to be fairly dark. Because it's all in the background, and because of the way the sky, the sun is highlighting the sky, and kind of the things in the landscape become really dark and shadowed, we still want to make it look quite dark. So I'm using a small fan brush. It's not very wide and it's not soft, it's fairly stiff. And I'm just making those markings for the trees in the background. So the trees in the background are quite uniform, and they don't really have much, like they're not leafy, they're kind of like stick trees. It makes it a lot easier to use a brush like that than individually drawing in each branch and each tree trunk with a small brush. It looks a little bit more random, and that makes it look more natural. So I'm going over it a few times and just adding some of the darker colors in the middles of those trees and towards the bottom, just to give it a bit of a variation so it doesn't all look the same. After I've finished with the top part, I'm ready to do the reflection of it in the water. Remember, as I mentioned before, whatever is above the horizon line will need to be reflected in the water, which means that we need to repeat the whole thing in the water section. And because water is moving, the reflections are going to be distorted. So some areas might look a bit darker, some areas are going to be maybe a little bit wider. And once you, like in some areas they light and they have some lines sort of going through them, like you can see the ripples in the water. So where the water looks a bit clearer and lighter, you're going to see a cleaner reflection, kind of almost like a mirror image. And in other areas, and where you get more color and possibly more movement, like where it's maybe close to the shoreline, you are going to see more distorted reflections. So I'm just going over and paying attention to not so much what's in my reference image, because that's kind of irrelevant now. I'm paying attention to where my trees and buildings are in the actual painting, because I want to paint in reflections in the same spot. So if I've got a tree there, there's got to be a tree reflected. If I've got a building there, the building's got to be reflected. So you don't need to worry too much about the actual detail so that it looks all perfect, just the shapes and the overall size of it, so to give an indication that there is something there. And as you're going through and you've painted in your reflections, then you can just add with a bit of a lighter touch and dry brushing, so making sure that you don't have much paint and water in your brush, that is fairly dry. You do like a dry brushing technique where you have your dry brush and you pick up a bit of paint and then you just rub it on your painting. It gives it a more textured look, and it sort of gives it a more natural look in some of the reflection areas where it's a bit lighter especially, and it's distorted with the ripples in the water. Once I'm happy with the reflections, I'm just going over some of the areas and darkening things up, especially right in the middle where the horizon line is, which is the darkest area, and I'm just making those adjustments. Once I've made the adjustments to the horizon line, I'm just going to go back into my water and make some more lines with that same brush and the same technique of dry brushing, just picking up a little bit of paint and just adding it to create more of those ripples in the water, but not very defined, still fairly well, not light, but darker tone of where I'm painting. So in the pink area, a little bit darker pink. in the purple area, darker version of that area, just adding those lines in there so you can just notice them. It gives you that feel of the water movement. And once all of those lines are in and I'm happy with it, we don't want to add it everywhere, just in some places to give you an idea. We don't want to overdo it. And then I assess the painting as a whole. Once I'm happy with it, that's going to finish my painting and of course this process video as well. If you would like to see more paintings like this, let me know in the comments of what it is that you would like to see next, and click thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when new videos come out. I will see you in the next one.